My blind date couldn't believe he saw me getting out of the car with another man, but it was just my brother. My hands trembled as I applied my lipstick for the third time, the coral shade that my daughter insisted would bring out the warmth in my eyes. At 64, I never imagined I'd be sitting in my bedroom mirror, nervous as a teenager before prom. The butterflies in my stomach felt foreign after 38 years of marriage to Harold, God rest his soul. "Mom, you look beautiful," Sarah had said when she set up this whole thing. "Robert is a gentleman, a retired professor like Dad was. You have so much in common." But standing here now, smoothing down my navy dress, the one that still fit well despite the extra pounds that seemed to settle around my middle after Harold passed, I wondered if I was making a terrible mistake. The doorbell rang, and my heart nearly stopped. That would be my brother Eddie, who'd insisted on driving me to Rosewood Bistro. "No way my little sister is taking an Uber to meet some stranger," he declared. Even though at 69, he was barely 5 years my senior, and I'd been perfectly capable of driving myself for nearly 50 years. I grabbed my purse, checked my reflection one final time, and tried to calm my racing pulse. The woman staring back at me looked nervous but hopeful. My silver hair, which I'd finally stopped coloring after Harold died, was styled in soft waves around my face. The small pearl earrings he'd given me for our 20th anniversary caught the light. I touched them gently, whispering a quiet prayer that he would understand, wherever he was, that I wasn't trying to replace him, I was simply trying to live again. Eddie stood on my front porch, keys jangling in his weathered hands, wearing his best button-down shirt and a tie I'd given him last Christmas. His gray hair was combed back neatly, and he'd shaved off the stubble he usually wore on weekends. "You clean up nice, big brother," I said, trying to inject some lightness into my voice. "Had to look presentable for your big debut back into the dating world," he grinned, but I caught the concern in his eyes. Eddie had been my rock since Harold's funeral 18 months ago, checking on me daily, fixing things around the house, making sure I wasn't retreating too far into my grief. As we walked to his car, I caught him glancing at me sideways. "You sure about this, Maggie? You don't have to do anything you're not ready for." I paused with my hand on the passenger door handle. "I don't know if anyone's ever ready, Eddie, but Sarah's right. I can't spend the rest of my life talking only to you, my children, and the checkout lady at the grocery store." He chuckled as we settled into his pristine Ford sedan, the same model he'd been driving for 15 years. Everything about Eddie was steady, reliable, unchanged. Sometimes I envied him that consistency, especially now when everything in my world felt uncertain and new. "Tell me again what you know about this Robert," I said as we pulled out of my driveway, passing the house where Harold and I had raised our 3 children, where we'd hosted countless barbecues and birthday parties, where I'd learned to be a widow. Well, according to Sarah's friend Lisa, he was married for 35 years before his wife passed 3 years ago. He taught literature at the community college, loves to read, has 2 grown kids who live out of state. He's been doing some volunteering at the library. Seems like a decent guy. Eddie merged onto the main road, driving with the same careful precision he'd shown since we were teenagers. And he asked to meet me based on what exactly? The question had been nagging at me since Sarah excitedly called a week ago with the news that she'd found someone perfect for me. "Lisa showed him your picture from the church directory, said you were a lovely woman who enjoyed books and gardening. He apparently said you had kind eyes and asked if you might be interested in coffee." Coffee had turned into dinner, somehow. When Lisa called to arrange the details, she'd mentioned that Robert had suggested Rosewood Bistro, a charming little place downtown that served comfort food and had been around for decades. "Somewhere we can actually hear each other talk," he'd reportedly said, which I appreciated. The loud sports bars and trendy restaurants my children frequented made my ears ring. We drove in comfortable silence for a few minutes, past the familiar landmarks of my neighborhood, the elementary school where all my kids had learned to read, the park where Harold had taught them to ride bikes, the church where we'd been married and where I'd said goodbye to him. The late afternoon sun cast everything in golden light, making even the ordinary seem touched with possibility. I keep thinking about what Harold would say, I admitted, watching a young mother push a stroller across a crosswalk. Eddie glanced over at me, his expression gentle. He'd want you to be happy, Maggie, you know that. I did know that, in my logical mind. Harold had been the most generous, loving man I'd ever known. During his final weeks, weak from the cancer, but still trying to take care of everyone around him, he'd taken my hand one evening and said, "Promise me you won't become a hermit when I'm gone. You have too much love left to give." But knowing something intellectually and feeling it in your heart were two very different things. What if I've forgotten how to talk to men? I asked, voicing one of my deepest fears. Harold and I had our own language after all those years. What if I say something stupid or spill something on my dress or... Maggie, Eddie's voice was firm but kind. You're one of the smartest, funniest, most interesting people I know. You raised 3 incredible kids. You taught Sunday school for 20 years. You can grow tomatoes that make the neighbors weep with envy. And you make the best apple pie in 3 counties. Any man would be lucky to have your attention for an evening. I smiled despite my nerves. You're biased. Damn right I am, but I'm also right. As we pulled into the parking lot of Rosewood Bistro, my stomach did a little flip. The restaurant was exactly as I remembered it from the few times Harold and I had eaten there. White clapboard siding, green shutters, flower boxes under every window bursting with petunias and marigolds. A chalkboard sign by the door advertised the evening special, meatloaf with garlic mashed potatoes and green beans. Eddie found a parking space near the front entrance, and I took a deep breath, trying to center myself. Through the large windows, I could see couples and families seated at tables covered with red and white checkered tablecloths, the warm glow of lamplight making everything look cozy and inviting. He said he'd be wearing a blue blazer and would get there a few minutes early to secure a table, I said, more to remind myself than inform Eddie. And if he turns out to be a creep or you just don't click, you text me and I'll be back in 10 minutes, Eddie said, pulling out his phone to check that the ringer was on. I nodded, gathering my courage along with my purse. This was it. My first date in over 40 years, my tentative step back into a world I'd never expected to navigate again. As Eddie came around to open my car door, always the gentleman, just like Harold had been, I caught a glimpse of a man in a blue blazer through the restaurant window. He was seated alone at a table for 2, checking his watch, and something about his posture suggested he might be as nervous as I was. "Ready?" Eddie asked, offering me his arm. "As ready as I'll ever be," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. We walked toward the entrance together, my heels clicking on the pavement, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had no idea that in the next few minutes, my carefully planned evening would take a turn I never could have anticipated, or that the man waiting for me inside was about to jump to a conclusion that would change everything about our first meeting. The hostess, a young woman with a bright smile and purple streaks in her hair, greeted us warmly as we stepped inside. The restaurant smelled like roasted chicken and fresh bread, and I felt some of my tension ease in the familiar, homey atmosphere. "I'm meeting someone," I said, scanning the dining room. "Robert Mitchell. He should already be here." "Oh, yes, Mr. Mitchell," she beamed. "He's right over there by the window. Such a nice gentleman. He's been here about 15 minutes. I followed her gesture and saw him immediately, a tall, silver-haired man in a navy blazer, just as described. He was looking toward the entrance, and our eyes met across the room. For a moment, neither of us moved. He looked distinguished but approachable, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a tentative smile. Not handsome in the way Harold had been, Harold with his dark hair and easy laugh, but there was something warm and genuine in his expression that made me want to know more. "That's him," I whispered to Eddie, my voice barely audible over the gentle din of conversation and clinking silverware. Eddie squeezed my arm reassuringly. "Go get him, Tiger." I started to walk toward the table, my legs feeling slightly unsteady, when I realized Eddie was following me. I turned back, confused. "I thought you were leaving?" "I want to walk you to the table first. Make sure you get settled. Old habits." He gave me an encouraging nod. "Plus, I want to get a look at this guy, make sure he passes the big brother inspection." I should have protested, should have insisted I could handle the introduction myself, but honestly, I was grateful for Eddie's steadying presence. We made our way through the restaurant together, past families with small children, elderly couples sharing quiet conversations, a group of women who looked to be about my age celebrating someone's birthday with a small chocolate cake. Robert stood as we approached, and I was struck by how tall he was, probably 6'2", with broad shoulders that spoke of someone who'd stayed active despite his years. His face showed the lines of someone who'd lived fully, laughed often, and probably worried his share too. When he smiled, his whole face transformed, becoming almost boyish. "Margaret," he said, and I loved the way he said my full name instead of the Maggie that everyone else used. His voice was deep, cultured, with just a hint of nervousness that mirrored my own. "Yes, that's me. And this is my brother Eddie. He was kind enough to give me a ride tonight." I expected Robert to shake Eddie's hand, exchange pleasantries, maybe make a joke about overprotective big brothers. Instead, his face changed completely. The warm smile vanished, replaced by an expression I couldn't quite read: confusion, disappointment, maybe even anger. "Your brother," he repeated slowly, looking between Eddie and me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Yes, Eddie Callahan. Robert, this is—" "I see." Robert's voice had gone cold, formal. He remained standing, but his posture had stiffened. "Well, this is certainly unexpected." Eddie and I exchanged a bewildered look. The hostess hovered nearby, clearly sensing the tension, but unsure whether to retreat or intervene. "I'm sorry, is there a problem?" I asked, my stomach beginning to sink. Had we gotten the wrong table? Was this not Robert Mitchell? Robert's laugh was short and bitter. "A problem? I suppose that depends on your perspective, Margaret." He gestured toward Eddie with barely concealed irritation. "When I agreed to meet you for dinner, I was under the impression it would be just the two of us. I wasn't expecting a chaperone." The words hit me like a physical blow. Heat flooded my cheeks as I realized what was happening. Somehow, Robert had gotten the impression that Eddie was what? My date? My companion? "Oh no," I said quickly, my voice rising slightly. "No, you don't understand. Eddie is just my brother. He drove me here because—" "Because she was nervous about meeting a stranger," Eddie cut in, his own voice taking on a protective edge. "And frankly, given your reaction, I'm glad I did." Robert's face flushed red above his collar. "I'm sorry. When I saw the two of you getting out of the car together, I assumed—" He trailed off, looking genuinely mortified. "I thought perhaps you were having second thoughts about meeting me and decided to bring someone else instead." The silence stretched between us, heavy with misunderstanding and embarrassment. Other diners were beginning to glance in our direction, and I felt exposed, foolish. This was exactly the kind of scenario I'd worried about. The awkwardness, the potential for things to go wrong in ways I couldn't anticipate. "Maybe I should go," I said quietly, my confidence evaporating like steam from a cup of coffee left too long on the counter. "No," Robert's voice was firm, and when I looked up, his expression had changed again. The coldness was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine regret. Please, Margaret, I owe you an apology. I jumped to conclusions, and I was completely out of line. He looked at Eddie, extending his hand. I'm sorry, Mr. Callahan. I misunderstood the situation, and I responded poorly. Your sister was fortunate to have someone looking out for her. Eddie studied Robert's face for a moment before accepting the handshake. She's been through a lot, he said simply. I just wanted to make sure she felt safe. Robert nodded, his eyes moving back to me. Would you give me a chance to start over? I promise I'm not usually such an idiot on first impressions. Despite everything, I found myself smiling. There was something endearing about his obvious discomfort, the way he was trying so hard to make amends. I suppose everyone deserves a second chance at first impressions. Eddie squeezed my shoulder. I'll leave you two to your dinner then. Maggie, call me when you're ready to come home. He kissed my cheek, whispered, he seems decent enough, just flustered, and headed for the door. As I watched my brother walk away, I felt suddenly alone and exposed. Robert hurried around the table to pull out my chair, a gesture that was both old-fashioned and sweet. I really am sorry, he said as I settled into my seat. I've been out of the dating game for so long, I apparently forgot how to behave like a civilized human being. I smoothed my napkin across my lap, buying time to collect my thoughts. How long has it been? Since you dated? He settled back into his own chair, looking more relaxed now, but still slightly sheepish. 3 years. Well, technically never, if we're being completely honest. Eleanor and I met in college, got married right after graduation. I never really dated anyone else. He paused, studying his water glass. What about you? Harold and I met when I was 22. We were married for 38 years before he passed. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest when I said Harold's name, but it was gentler now than it had been even a few months ago. Robert's face softened. I'm sorry for your loss. Lisa mentioned that you'd been widowed. It's a difficult club to belong to. Yes, it is. Our eyes met across the table, and I felt a moment of connection, recognition. Here was someone who understood the particular loneliness of losing a life partner, the way grief could ambush you at the grocery store or during a favorite television program. The waitress appeared beside our table, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and sensible shoes. Good evening, folks. I'm Donna, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you off with something to drink? I think I need a glass of wine, I said, surprising myself. I rarely drank, but the evening's emotional ups and downs had left me feeling like I needed something to steady my nerves. The house Chardonnay is very nice, Donna suggested. Perfect. Robert ordered a beer, and after Donna left to fetch our drinks, we sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both of us apparently processing the rocky start to our evening. Can I ask what made you think Eddie was, well, not my brother? I said finally. Robert rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture that made him look younger despite his silver hair. Honestly, I've been so nervous about tonight that I got here early and spent 20 minutes watching the parking lot like some kind of stalker. When I saw you get out of that car with a man, my brain just went to the worst-case scenario. I thought maybe you were having second thoughts, or that you'd brought backup in case I turned out to be terrible company. I couldn't help but laugh. You were watching the parking lot? Like a hawk, he admitted, grinning ruefully. I kept checking my watch, adjusting my tie, rehearsing conversation topics. I haven't been this nervous since my doctoral defense. What did you teach? I asked, grateful for the change of subject. American literature, mostly, 20th century. I spent 35 years trying to convince college students that Steinbeck and Hemingway were worth reading. His eyes lit up as he talked about his career, and I caught a glimpse of the teacher he must have been, passionate, engaging, probably beloved by his students. Donna returned with our drinks, and I took a grateful sip of the Chardonnay. It was crisp and cold, and I felt some of the evening's tension begin to dissolve. What about you? Robert asked. Lisa mentioned you were married to a professor as well. Harold taught high school English for 40 years. He always joked that I got the better deal. I only had to put up with teenage attitudes at home with our own 3 kids, while he faced classrooms full of them every day. I smiled at the memory, but he loved it. Even after he retired, he tutored kids who were struggling, said every student deserved someone who believed they could succeed. He sounds like a good man. He was. I took another sip of wine, feeling brave enough to ask the question that had been hovering in my mind. What about Eleanor? How long has she been gone? Robert's expression grew thoughtful. 3 years next month. Cancer, like your Harold. It was brutal at the end, but we had good years, raised 2 wonderful kids. She would have liked you, I think. I felt an unexpected warmth at the comment. What makes you say that? She always said she could tell everything she needed to know about a person by looking at their eyes. She would have seen the kindness in yours right away. He paused, studying my face. She also would have gotten a good laugh out of the way I've handled tonight. Eleanor always said I overthought everything. The menu lay unopened between us, but neither of us seemed in a hurry to order. There was something about this conversation, the way we were slowly opening up to each other, that felt more important than food. So, what made you finally decide to try dating? I asked, if you don't mind me asking. Robert was quiet for a moment, rolling his beer bottle between his palms. Loneliness, if I'm being honest. My kids live in California and Oregon, so I see them maybe twice a year. I volunteer at the library, I read, I work in my garden, but at the end of the day, I go home to an empty house and eat dinner while watching the news. Eleanor used to say that life was meant to be shared. He looked up at me. What about you? What made you say yes to this? I thought about Sarah's enthusiastic matchmaking, about the way the silence in my house sometimes felt deafening, about waking up each morning with no one to share my dreams with, no one to ask about my day. My daughter set this up, I said, but I think I said yes because Harold made me promise I wouldn't give up on living. And lately, I've realized that surviving and living aren't the same thing. Robert nodded slowly. No, they're not. Donna returned to take our dinner orders, and I was relieved to discover that both Robert and I gravitated toward the comfort food end of the menu. He ordered the meatloaf special, I chose the pot roast, and we both declined appetizers in favor of extending our conversation. So, tell me about your children, Robert said after Donna disappeared toward the kitchen. 3, you said? I felt my face light up the way it always did when I talked about my kids. Sarah's the oldest. She's the one who orchestrated this whole evening. She's a nurse practitioner in pediatrics, married to a wonderful man named David, and they have 2 little ones, Emma and Jake. They live about 20 minutes from me, which is both a blessing and a curse depending on how much Sarah thinks she needs to manage my life. Robert chuckled. The well-meaning but meddlesome adult child. I have one of those too. Then there's Michael, my middle child. He's in Denver, works in software development. He's single, travels constantly for work, calls me every Sunday like clockwork. And my baby, Jennifer, lives in Portland with her partner, Lisa. Yes, the same Lisa who set us up. Jenny's a high school art teacher, and she's the most creative person I know. Always has been. Even as a little girl, she saw the world differently than the rest of us. They sound wonderful. Do you see them often? Sarah and her family, all the time. Maybe too much. She seems to think I can't manage basic life tasks without supervision. I thought about all the times in recent months when Sarah had shown up unannounced with groceries or called to check that I'd remembered to eat lunch. The other 2, not nearly enough. Michael managed to come home for Christmas, and Jenny, well, it's expensive to fly cross-country, and teachers don't make much money. My daughter Amy is a teacher too, Robert said, 3rd grade in San Diego. She has this amazing ability to connect with kids, even the challenging ones. My son Peter is an attorney in Portland. He's always trying to get me to move out there, says I need to be closer to family. Have you considered it? Every day, he admitted, but this is home, you know. Eleanor and I built our life here. Our friends are here, our church, our routines. I'm not sure I'm ready to start over completely somewhere new. I nodded, understanding completely. After Harold died, both Michael and Jenny had suggested I consider moving to be closer to one of them. But the idea of leaving the house where we'd raised our family, the community where we'd put down such deep roots, felt overwhelming. Besides, Robert continued, what if I moved out there and then met someone wonderful who lived right here in town? The comment was clearly meant to be flirtatious, and I felt my cheeks warm. It had been so long since anyone had flirted with me that I wasn't sure how to respond. Harold's romantic overtures had evolved over the years into comfortable, familiar gestures, a hand on my shoulder while I cooked dinner, a quick kiss before he left for work. This felt entirely different, new and slightly thrilling. That would be inconvenient timing, I managed, and was rewarded with one of Robert's transformative smiles. Our dinners arrived, and the conversation flowed easily as we ate. Robert told me about his volunteer work at the library. He helped with the adult literacy program and led a monthly book discussion group. I shared stories about my garden, my part-time job at the church office, my weekly bridge game with 3 other widows who had become my closest friends since Harold's death. What do you miss most? Robert asked during a lull in the conversation. About being married, I mean. The question caught me off guard with its directness, but I appreciated his honesty. The little things, I said after thinking for a moment. Having someone to ask, did you remember to turn off the coffee pot? Having someone notice when I get a haircut. Someone to share the funny things that happen during my day. You know how some stories lose their charm if you wait too long to tell them. Robert nodded. Eleanor used to say that experiences weren't fully real until she'd shared them with me. I'd come home from work and she'd be bursting with stories. Something funny one of the neighbors did, or a beautiful bird she'd seen in the garden, or a call from one of the kids. Now I find myself having these moments of wanting to tell her something and then remembering. Yes, I said softly. Exactly. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of shared understanding settling between us. I looked around the restaurant, noticing how the other couple seemed to fit together so naturally. The way they leaned toward each other, finished each other's sentences, shared food from each other's plates without asking. Harold and I had been like that once, so attuned to each other that we could communicate with just a look across a crowded room. Can I tell you something? Robert said, his voice quiet enough that I had to lean forward to hear him clearly. Of course. I almost canceled tonight, 3 times actually. Once this morning, once this afternoon, and once when I was getting dressed. He set down his fork and looked directly at me. I kept thinking about all the ways it could go wrong, all the reasons why a beautiful, intelligent woman like you wouldn't be interested in someone like me. The compliment took my breath away. When was the last time someone had called me beautiful? Harold had, of course, right up until the end, but I'd always assumed that was just the love talking, the way long married couples see each other through the lens of shared history rather than current reality. Someone like you? I asked. A widower with too much time on his hands, a man who talks to his dog more than he talks to other people, someone who still wears the same cologne he wore in college because Eleanor picked it out. He gave me a self-deprecating smile. I was convinced you'd take one look at me and find an excuse to leave early. I thought about my own morning of anxiety, the multiple outfit changes, the way I'd practiced conversation topics in my car during the drive to Sarah's house to pick up the earrings I'd forgotten. I tried on 4 different dresses, I confessed, and I've been wearing the same perfume since 1987 because Harold bought it for me for Christmas that year and said it smelled like springtime. Robert's smile broadened. What's it called? White Shoulders, probably terribly outdated. Eleanor wore White Shoulders, he said softly. I'd recognize that scent anywhere. I felt something shift between us, a deepening of connection that went beyond the simple pleasures of good conversation and shared experiences. Here was someone who understood not just the logistics of widowhood, the empty houses and quiet dinners, but the emotional landscape as well. The way grief could coexist with gratitude, the guilt that sometimes accompanied moments of happiness, the fear that moving forward meant leaving beloved memories behind. "Robert," I said, then stopped, not sure how to articulate what I was feeling. "What is it?" "I'm scared," I admitted. "Not of you, but of this, of liking you, of the possibility that this could become something important." He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. His skin was warm, slightly rough, with the kind of calluses that spoke of someone who worked with his hands in his garden or workshop. "I'm scared too," he said. "Terrified, actually." "But maybe being scared means it matters." I looked down at our joined hands, thinking about Harold's hands, how different they'd been, long and graceful where Robert's were broad and strong, smooth where Robert's were weathered. For a moment, I felt a pang of what felt like betrayal, as if by enjoying Robert's touch, I was somehow diminishing what Harold and I had shared. But then I remembered Harold's words from that evening near the end. "Promise me you won't become a hermit when I'm gone." He'd squeezed my hand then, just the way Robert was doing now, and I'd seen in his eyes not just love, but permission, his blessing on whatever happiness might come after he was gone. "Yes," I said, looking up to meet Robert's gaze. "Maybe it does." We lingered over coffee and dessert, apple pie for me, chocolate cake for Robert, neither of us seeming eager for the evening to end. The restaurant had emptied out around us, and Donna had refilled our coffee cups 3 times with the patient kindness of someone who understood that some conversations couldn't be rushed. "I have a confession," Robert said, cutting another small bite of his cake. "When I saw your picture in that church directory, I studied it for about 20 minutes. Lisa thought I was being ridiculous, but I wanted to see if I could imagine having a conversation with you." "And what did you conclude?" "That you had the kind of face that suggested good stories. I was right about that, by the way." I felt myself blushing again. "What kind of stories have I told? The one about your grandson trying to teach you to use his tablet and accidentally ordering 40 pounds of cat food online? The way you described your daughter Sarah's attempts to reorganize your kitchen cabinets? That story about Harold and the raccoons getting into your garbage cans?" Robert's eyes were warm with appreciation. "You see the humor in everyday life. Eleanor was like that too. She could make me laugh about the most ordinary things." "Harold used to say I collected moments," I said, surprised by the memory. He'd tease me about the way I'd remember exactly what someone was wearing when they told me a funny story, or how the light looked coming through the kitchen window during a particular conversation. He said I was like a curator of small happenings. That's a beautiful way to put it. I looked around the restaurant, trying to curate this moment. The way the lamplight cast shadows on Robert's face, the gentle clink of dishes from the kitchen, the satisfied sleepiness in Donna's movements as she wiped down empty tables. How would I describe this evening to Sarah tomorrow? What details would I want to remember? "Can I ask you something personal?" I said. "Anything. Do you feel guilty about being here, about enjoying yourself?" Robert was quiet for so long that I wondered if I'd overstepped, asked something too intimate for a first date. But when he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than uncomfortable. "Every day," he said. "Some days more than others. Today, getting ready to come here, I kept thinking Eleanor would have opinions about my shirt choice, would have reminded me to check if I had enough cash for a tip, would have told me to relax and be myself." He paused, stirring his coffee absently. "And then I had this moment where I could almost hear her saying, 'For heaven's sake, Robert, just go and have a nice time. I'm not going anywhere.'" I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Harold told me something similar near the end. He made me promise I wouldn't spend the rest of my life talking only to his picture. "Do you talk to his picture?" I nodded, slightly embarrassed. "Every morning. I tell him what I'm planning to do that day, ask him what he thinks about things. Sarah would probably have me committed if she knew. Robert smiled. I talked to Eleanor's rosebush. She planted it the year before she got sick, and now it blooms like crazy every summer. The neighbors probably think I've lost my mind, standing out there having full conversations with a flower bush. What do you tell her? Everything. About my day, about the book I'm reading, about how much I miss her terrible cooking. We both laughed at that. And lately, I've been telling her about you, about being nervous to meet you, about wondering if I'd remember how to be good company for someone new. The intimacy of that confession took my breath away. What did she say? That's the funny thing. I can almost hear her responses. She'd want to know if you were kind, if you made me laugh, if you seemed like the sort of person who'd be patient with an old fool who's forgotten how to date. Robert looked directly at me. I think she'd like you, Margaret. I think she'd approve. I reached for my purse, pulling out a tissue to dab at my eyes. I'm sorry, I don't usually cry on first dates, though to be fair, I don't usually go on first dates. Don't apologize. This isn't exactly a typical first date conversation, is it? No, I agreed, but maybe that's not a bad thing. Donna approached our table with the check, and I felt a flutter of panic. The evening was ending, and I had no idea what happened next. Were there rules for this sort of thing? Should I offer to pay half? Should I wait for Robert to suggest a second date, or would that be presumptuous? Robert handled the check without making a show of it, waving away my offer to contribute, and then we found ourselves standing in the parking lot under a sky full of stars, the moment I'd been dreading all evening. I should call Eddie, I said, pulling out my phone, let him know I'm ready to be picked up. Actually, Robert said, looking suddenly uncertain, I was wondering if you might like to take a walk first. There's a nice path around the pond behind the restaurant. It's well lit, perfectly safe. I looked toward the path he was indicating, surprised by how much I wanted to say yes. The evening air was warm but not humid, perfect for walking, and I wasn't ready to get into Eddie's car and answer all his inevitable questions about how things had gone. I'd like that, I said. We walked slowly along the gravel path that circled the small pond, close enough that our shoulders occasionally brushed, but far enough apart to maintain the careful space of new acquaintance. The water reflected the lights from the restaurant and the stars above, and I found myself thinking again about moments worth curating. Margaret, Robert said after we'd walked in comfortable silence for several minutes, would you be interested in seeing me again? Maybe for coffee this time, something less formal. The question I'd been hoping for and dreading in equal measure. Yes, I said, surprising myself with how quickly and certainly the word came out. I'd like that very much. Saturday afternoon? There's a little coffee shop downtown that serves excellent scones. We could sit outside if the weather holds. That sounds perfect, I said, and meant it. We completed our circuit of the pond and found ourselves back at the parking lot, where the reality of the evening's end could no longer be avoided. I called Eddie, who answered on the first ring as if he'd been sitting by his phone waiting. How did it go? He asked immediately. Fine, I said, aware that Robert was listening. I'll tell you about it on the drive home. 5 minutes, Eddie said. I'm just down the street getting gas. Robert walked me to the spot where Eddie would pick me up, and we stood there in the gentle pool of light from a street lamp, two people who'd started the evening as strangers and were ending it as, what? Friends? Potential something more? Thank you, Robert said, for giving me a second chance after I made such a mess of our introduction. Thank you for not running away when you realized I came with a bodyguard, I replied. He laughed, and the sound made something warm unfurl in my chest. Your brother seems like a good man. I respect him for looking out for you. Eddie's car pulled into the parking lot, and I felt an unexpected reluctance to leave. The evening had been full of surprises. Robert's initial misunderstanding, the easy flow of conversation once we'd gotten past our mutual nervousness, the way he'd made me feel interesting and attractive without being presumptuous or overly familiar. "Saturday then," Robert said, "around 2 o'clock? I'll be there." He leaned forward and kissed my cheek, a brief, gentle gesture that somehow felt more intimate than a handshake, but less presumptuous than anything more. His aftershave was subtle, woodsy, completely different from Harold's, but pleasant in its own way. "Good night, Margaret." "Good night, Robert." I walked to Eddie's car with what I hoped was appropriate dignity, though inside I felt like a teenager who'd just been asked to prom. Eddie got out to open my door, a courtesy he'd never abandoned, despite my protests that I was perfectly capable of opening car doors myself. "Well," he said as soon as we were both settled in the car, "don't keep me in suspense." I buckled my seatbelt, buying time to organize my thoughts. How could I explain the evening to Eddie, the rocky start, the gradual warming, the way Robert had looked at me when he talked about Eleanor, the surprising comfort I'd felt sharing stories about Harold? "He's nice," I said finally. "A bit awkward at first, but nice." "Nice? That's it? You were in there for 3 hours?" "We talked about our spouses, our children, our lives. He makes me laugh, and he listens when I talk. He's going to call me this week." Eddie glanced over at me as we waited at a red light. "You like him." It wasn't a question. Eddie had always been able to read my emotions, even when I tried to hide them. "I think I do," I admitted. "Is that terrible?" "Terrible? Maggie, it's wonderful. You deserve to have someone to share things with, someone who appreciates what a catch you are." "I'm 64 years old, Eddie. I have gray hair and arthritis in my knees and reading glasses in every room of my house. I'm hardly a catch." "You're smart and funny and kind, and you make the best chocolate chip cookies in the county. Any man would be lucky to spend time with you." Eddie's voice was firm, the tone he'd used when we were children and someone at school had been mean to me. "Harold knew that, and this Robert fellow would be an idiot not to see it too." We drove through the familiar streets of my neighborhood, past houses where I'd watched neighbors' children grow up, past the corner where Harold and I used to take our evening walks, past the mailbox where I still sometimes expected to find letters addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Harold Thompson. "Are you going to see him again?" Eddie asked as we pulled into my driveway. "Saturday afternoon, coffee and scones." Eddie smiled as he walked me to my front door. "That's my girl. Take it slow, trust your instincts, and call me if you need anything." I hugged my brother goodnight, grateful once again for his steady presence in my life. As I watched him drive away, I realized I was still smiling. Inside my house, I kicked off my heels and walked through the familiar rooms, seeing them with fresh eyes after my evening out. The kitchen where Harold and I had shared thousands of meals, the living room where we'd watched our children grow up, the bedroom where I'd held his hand during his final days. All of it felt the same, but somehow different, as if the possibility of new happiness had shifted the light in subtle ways. I sat on the edge of my bed, still wearing my navy dress, and looked at the framed photo on Harold's side of the nightstand. He was smiling in the picture, taken during our last vacation together to the mountains, his arm around my shoulders, both of us squinting slightly in the bright sunshine. "Well," I said aloud, feeling only slightly foolish, "that was unexpected." I told Harold about the evening, Robert's initial confusion, the way conversation had flowed once we'd relaxed, the plans for Saturday. "I think you'd like him," I said finally. "He loved his wife the way you loved me. He understands about loss, about memory, about the way grief and gratitude can exist in the same space." I changed into my nightgown and went through my usual bedtime routine, but sleep felt impossible. My mind kept replaying moments from the evening, the warmth in Robert's eyes when he smiled, the way he'd listened to my stories about the grandchildren, the careful respect with which he'd spoken about Harold. "I think you'd like him," I said finally. "He loved his wife the way you loved me. He understands about loss, about memory, about the way grief and gratitude can exist in the same space. I changed into my nightgown and went through my usual bedtime routine, but sleep felt impossible. My mind kept replaying moments from the evening, the warmth in Robert's eyes when he smiled, the way he'd listened to my stories about the grandchildren, the careful respect with which he'd spoken about Harold. I found myself wondering what Robert was doing at that moment. Was he having trouble sleeping too? Was he reviewing our conversation, analyzing whether he'd said the right things? Was he second-guessing his invitation for Saturday? The questions followed me into sleep, along with a feeling I'd almost forgotten: anticipation. For the first time in 18 months, I had something specific to look forward to, beyond my weekly routines and family obligations. Saturday felt like a small, bright light in the distance, a reason to choose my outfit carefully, to plan my day around something that was entirely my own. Friday passed in a blur of nervous energy and practical preparations. I found myself cleaning my house with unusual thoroughness, as if Robert might somehow appear at my door despite our plans to meet at the coffee shop. Sarah called to check on how the date had gone, and I gave her a carefully edited version that emphasized Robert's kindness while downplaying my own growing excitement. "So you're seeing him again?" Sarah asked, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "Coffee on Saturday, nothing dramatic." "Mom, it's okay to be excited about this. Dad would want you to be happy." I knew she was right, but knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were still two different things. Part of me worried that I was betraying Harold's memory by enjoying another man's company, even though Harold himself had encouraged me to remain open to new relationships. Saturday morning dawned clear and warm, with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything seem possible. I spent longer than usual choosing my outfit, finally settling on a burgundy sweater that brought out the auburn highlights in my silver hair, paired with comfortable slacks and the pearl earrings that had become my talisman for venturing into the unknown. The coffee shop Robert had suggested was in the historic district downtown, a charming place called the Daily Grind that I'd driven past countless times but never entered. When I arrived at 5 minutes before 2, I was pleased to see that he was already there, seated at a small table on the outdoor patio, reading a book and looking completely at ease. He stood when he saw me approaching, and I felt again that little flutter of attraction I'd experienced at the restaurant. In the afternoon sunlight, I could see that his eyes were actually hazel rather than brown, and his smile seemed even warmer than I'd remembered. "Margaret," he said, and again I loved the way he said my full name. "You look lovely." "Thank you." I settled into the chair he'd pulled out for me, noting the book he'd been reading, a collection of essays by E.B. White. Good choice in reading material. One of my favorites. I've probably read Once More to the Lake 50 times, and it still makes me tear up at the end. He flagged down a waitress, a young woman with paint-stained fingertips who looked like she might be an art student. "What can I get you to drink?" I ordered a cappuccino, Robert asked for black coffee, and we both decided to share a blueberry scone that looked impossibly fresh and tempting. "How was your week?" Robert asked, after the waitress had taken our order. "Quiet. I spent some time in the garden, had lunch with my bridge group, did some reading." I paused, then decided to be honest. "I thought about our dinner quite a bit." "Good thoughts, I hope?" "Very good thoughts." I felt myself blushing but pushed forward. I kept remembering things you'd said or funny moments from our conversation. It's been a long time since I've had that kind of mental replay after spending time with someone new. Robert's smile was warm and slightly relieved. I'm glad I'm not the only one. I found myself telling Eleanor's rosebush all about you yesterday afternoon. The neighbors probably think I've completely lost my mind. Our drinks arrived, along with the scone, which turned out to be as delicious as it looked. We fell into easy conversation, picking up threads from our dinner date and weaving in news stories. Robert told me about his week volunteering at the library, where he'd helped an elderly man learn to use email so he could stay in touch with his grandchildren in Alaska. I shared the saga of my ongoing battle with the squirrels who had declared war on my bird feeders. "I've tried everything," I said, gesturing with my coffee cup. "Special feeders, hot pepper in the seed, moving the feeders to different locations. But these squirrels are like tiny criminal masterminds. I swear they have meetings to plan their next assault." Robert laughed, the kind of genuine, delighted laugh that made his whole face light up. "Have you considered that maybe they're just more determined than you are? Perhaps it's time to negotiate a treaty." Negotiate with squirrels? Why not? Clearly, they're the superior strategists in this relationship. I found myself laughing too, surprised by how natural it felt to be silly with him, to let my guard down in ways I hadn't with anyone outside my family since Harold's death. "You know," Robert said, breaking off another piece of scone, "I have to admit something. After we made plans for today, I spent an embarrassing amount of time this week wondering if you'd change your mind." "Why would I change my mind?" "I don't know. Maybe you'd decide I was too old, or too set in my ways, or that I talked too much about Eleanor." He paused, looking slightly vulnerable. "Dating at our age feels like such uncharted territory. All the rules I might have known 40 years ago seem irrelevant now." I thought about my own week of overthinking, wondering if I'd been too forward, too emotional, too obviously out of practice at this whole business of getting to know someone new. "I don't think there are rules," I said. "I think we just have to figure it out as we go along." "That's both terrifying and liberating." "Yes, it is." We talked for another hour, the conversation flowing as easily as it had at dinner. Robert told me about his children, Amy the teacher, who called him every Sunday and was constantly trying to set him up with her colleagues, and Peter the lawyer, who worried that his father was becoming too isolated and kept forwarding articles about successful aging and staying socially connected. "They mean well," Robert said, "but sometimes I feel like they see me as a problem to be solved rather than a person living his life." I nodded, thinking of Sarah's well-intentioned but sometimes overwhelming attention. Sarah does the same thing. She'll show up with groceries I didn't ask for, or call to remind me about doctor's appointments I've had written on my calendar for weeks. I know it comes from love, but sometimes I feel like I'm being managed rather than supported. Exactly. They can't imagine that we might actually be capable of managing our own lives just because we're alone now. Or that being alone isn't necessarily the same thing as being lonely, I added. Robert gave me a thoughtful look. "Are you? Lonely, I mean." The question was direct but not invasive, asked with genuine curiosity rather than pity. I considered how to answer honestly. "Sometimes," I said finally, "usually in the evenings or when something funny happens and I want to share it with someone. But I've discovered that there's a difference between missing companionship and being desperate for it. I was worried that agreeing to meet you meant I was crossing over into desperate territory." And now, I think maybe wanting to share good conversation and laughter with someone doesn't make me desperate. Maybe it just makes me human. Robert reached across the table and touched my hand briefly. "For what it's worth, I think you're handling all of this with remarkable grace." I don't feel very graceful most of the time. Grace isn't about feeling graceful. It's about moving forward with kindness and courage, even when you're not sure of your footing. The comment was so unexpectedly insightful that I felt tears prick at my eyes. That's a beautiful way to think about it. Eleanor used to say that. She had a gift for finding wisdom in difficult situations. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the afternoon foot traffic along the historic street. Young families with strollers, teenagers sharing headphones, elderly couples walking slowly and holding hands. I found myself wondering what Harold and I had looked like to younger people when we walked together, whether they'd seen us as we'd seen ourselves, still surprised to be middle-aged, still discovering new things about each other after decades of marriage. "Margaret," Robert said, pulling me back to the present moment, "I hope this isn't too forward, but I was wondering if you might like to have dinner again next week, maybe somewhere we could hear each other talk, like last time, but perhaps a bit more casual?" I felt that flutter of anticipation again, stronger this time. "What did you have in mind?" "There's a little Italian place about 15 minutes from here that makes the best chicken parmesan I've ever tasted. It's the kind of place where they've had the same red checker tablecloths for 30 years, and the owner's grandmother's recipes are still hanging in the kitchen." "That sounds perfect. Thursday evening, 7 o'clock? I'll be there." I paused, feeling brave. "And Robert, you don't have to worry about being too forward. I appreciate directness at our age. We don't have time for games or excessive subtlety." His smile was radiant. Another advantage of dating in our 60s, we can say what we mean. Exactly. We finished our coffee and scone, and Robert walked me to my car, a courtesy that felt both old-fashioned and exactly right. As I drove home, I found myself humming, actually humming, something I hadn't done since before Harold got sick. The week passed more quickly than any week had in recent memory. I found myself thinking about Robert at odd moments, while watering my plants, during my weekly grocery shopping, in the quiet minutes before sleep. Not obsessive thoughts, but gentle ones, like a pleasant song playing softly in the background of my daily routine. Tuesday afternoon, he called to confirm our dinner plans, and we talked for nearly an hour about books we'd been reading, the changing leaves in our respective neighborhoods, and a funny story about his attempt to help his neighbor assemble a new barbecue grill. "I swear these instruction manuals are written by people who've never actually tried to put anything together," he said, and I could hear the laughter in his voice. We ended up with what looked like a modern art sculpture instead of a functioning grill. "Did you eventually figure it out?" "Only after my neighbor's teenage grandson came over and fixed it in about 10 minutes. Apparently there's a YouTube video for everything these days." I found myself looking forward to our phone conversations almost as much as our in-person meetings. There was something intimate about talking without the distractions of visual cues, just the sound of his voice and the rhythm of our exchanges. Thursday evening, I arrived at Mama Rosa's, the Italian restaurant Robert had suggested, to find him already seated at a corner table, studying the menu with the same serious attention he'd probably once given to student papers. The restaurant was exactly as he'd described, family-owned, slightly worn around the edges, filled with the kind of authentic charm that newer establishments tried to recreate but never quite achieved. "I hope you don't mind that I got here early," Robert said as I approached the table. "I wanted to make sure we got a good spot." "Not at all. I appreciate punctuality." The evening unfolded with even more ease than our previous meetings. We shared an antipasto platter, debated the merits of different pasta shapes, and discovered a mutual love for tiramisu that bordered on the obsessive. The conversation ranged from lighthearted to serious, touching on everything from our favorite movies to our concerns about aging to our hopes for our children's futures. "Amy keeps telling me I should try online dating," Robert said over dessert. "She's convinced that's how people meet now." Sarah suggested the same thing to me. She even offered to help me create a profile. I shuddered slightly at the memory. The idea of summarizing myself in a few paragraphs for strangers to evaluate feels horrifying. What would you even say? Widowed woman seeks companionship for quiet dinners and possible hand-holding? I laughed. Enjoys reading, gardening, and long conversations about deceased spouses? Must appreciate stories about grandchildren and not mind occasional references to arthritis? We dissolved into giggles, earning amused looks from the couple at the next table. There was something wonderfully freeing about being able to joke about the realities of dating at our age, to acknowledge the absurdities without being defeated by them. "I'm glad we met the old-fashioned way," Robert said when our laughter subsided. "Through mutual friends with real introductions and face-to-face conversations." "Me too, though I have to admit, after the way you reacted to seeing me with Eddie, I wondered if maybe we should have exchanged references and background checks first." Robert groaned, covering his face with his hands. "Are you ever going to let me live that down?" "Probably not. It's become one of my favorite stories to tell." "At least I provided you with good material." As we prepared to leave, Robert helped me with my coat, another small gesture that felt both courtly and natural. Walking to our cars, I realized I'd reached a decision that had been forming gradually over the past 2 weeks. "Robert," I said, stopping beside my car, "would you like to come over for dinner this weekend? I could cook for you, show you my famous garden that I keep talking about." The invitation surprised me as much as it did him. I hadn't planned to ask, but something about the evening, the easy comfort between us, had made the words tumble out. "I would love that," he said, his face lighting up. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. Saturday evening, around 6. Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself, and maybe an appetite. I tend to cook as if I'm feeding a family of 8, even when it's just me." He kissed my cheek again as we said goodnight, and this time the gesture felt less tentative, more natural. Driving home, I realized I was nervous about having Robert in my house, in the space I'd shared with Harold for so many years. But underneath the nervousness was excitement, anticipation for sharing another piece of my life with someone who was quickly becoming important to me. Friday was a blur of meal planning and house cleaning. I decided on Harold's favorite recipe for beef stew, then second-guessed myself and changed the menu to chicken and dumplings, then changed it again to a simple roast with vegetables. Finally, I called my sister-in-law for advice. "Make whatever you're comfortable cooking," she said sensibly. "The food isn't really the point." She was right, of course. The food wasn't the point. The point was sharing my space, my life, my most personal environment with someone new. The point was taking another step toward whatever this relationship was becoming. Saturday afternoon, I changed clothes 3 times and rearranged the living room furniture twice before finally accepting that I was as ready as I was going to be. The house smelled like the roast that was finishing in the oven. I'd set the dining room table with my good china, and I'd even cut flowers from my garden for a centerpiece. At exactly 6 o'clock, I heard Robert's car in my driveway. Through the front window, I watched him sit for a moment before getting out, and I wondered if he was having the same attack of nerves that I was experiencing. But when I opened the door, his smile was warm and confident, and he was carrying a bouquet of chrysanthemums in autumn colors. "For the hostess," he said, offering me the flowers. "They're beautiful. Come in, please." As Robert stepped into my foyer, I tried to see my home through his eyes. The family photos covering every available surface, Harold's reading chair still positioned by the window where he'd spent countless hours, the slight wear patterns in the carpet that spoke of decades of daily life. Everything was clean and welcoming, but undeniably marked by the life I'd shared with another man. "This is lovely, Margaret," Robert said, looking around with genuine appreciation. "It feels like a real home." I led him through the house, pointing out Harold's study, the kitchen where I'd raised 3 children and countless batches of cookies, the back porch where we'd spent summer evenings watching thunderstorms roll across the sky. Robert listened to my stories and asked thoughtful questions, treating my memories with respect rather than awkwardness. "And this," I said, opening the back door, "is the famous garden." Robert stepped onto the porch and whistled softly. Even in the fading light of early October, the garden was impressive. Neat rows of vegetables, flower beds that were still blooming with late-season perennials, fruit trees heavy with apples that would soon be ready for harvest. Margaret, this is incredible. You're a true gardener. Harold always said I had a gift for making things grow. I pointed out the different sections: vegetables, herbs, flowers, the small greenhouse where I started seedlings each spring. It's been my therapy since he died. When I'm out here with my hands in the dirt, everything else seems to quiet down. I can see why. There's something about gardens that feels hopeful, doesn't there? All that faith in the future, planting seeds and trusting they'll grow. I looked at Robert, struck by his understanding. Yes, exactly. Hope made tangible. We walked through the garden together as the sun set, and I found myself sharing stories I hadn't told anyone. How Harold had built the raised beds when my knees started bothering me, how we'd planned each year's plantings together over the kitchen table during the long winter months, how I still caught myself buying seeds for vegetables he'd particularly enjoyed. "He sounds like he was a wonderful partner," Robert said as we headed back inside. He was. We were lucky. Not everyone gets 40 years with their best friend. No, they don't. Over dinner, Robert told me about his own marriage, the small daily kindnesses that had sustained him and Eleanor through raising children, career pressures, financial struggles, and finally illness. His stories were full of the same kind of genuine affection I'd heard in my own voice when I talked about Harold, and I realized how much I appreciated being with someone who understood that our past relationships weren't competition for whatever we might build together. They were foundation, proof that we both knew how to love well. "Can I tell you something?" Robert said as we cleared the dinner dishes. "When I walked into your house tonight, I was terrified I'd feel like an intruder, like I was trespassing on sacred ground. And instead, I feel welcomed. You've shared your memories generously, without making me feel like I have to compete with them or pretend they don't exist." I felt a rush of gratitude for his honesty. I was worried about the same thing. I thought having you here might feel like a betrayal of Harold, or that seeing someone else at my dinner table might be too painful. But it wasn't. I considered the question seriously. There had been moments during the evening when I'd felt Harold's absence acutely, when Robert had complimented the meal and I'd wanted to share that Harold had loved the same recipe, when I'd caught sight of Harold's empty reading chair and felt a pang of loss. But there had also been moments of pure present tense joy. Robert's laughter at my story about the squirrels, his obvious appreciation for my garden, the way he'd insisted on helping with the dishes despite being a guest. "It wasn't," I said finally. "Different than I expected, but not painful. Actually, it felt right." Robert smiled, and I realized we were standing very close together in my kitchen, the dinner dishes forgotten on the counter. For a moment, I thought he might kiss me, really kiss me, not just the gentle cheek kisses we'd shared before. My heart raced at the possibility, and I felt simultaneously terrified and hopeful. But instead, Robert stepped back slightly, giving me space. "Margaret, I want you to know that I care about you, more than I expected to, more than I was prepared for. But I also want you to feel comfortable setting the pace for whatever this becomes." I looked at this kind, patient man who was offering me exactly what I needed: time, space, and the freedom to navigate this new territory at my own speed. In that moment, I made a decision that surprised me. "Robert," I said, reaching for his hand, "would you like to stay for coffee? We could sit on the porch and watch the stars come out." His smile was answer enough. We settled on the porch swing that Harold had hung 15 years earlier, coffee cups in hand, a comfortable distance between us, but close enough that I could feel the warmth of Robert's presence. The October evening was mild, with just enough breeze to rustle the leaves in the oak tree that dominated my backyard. "I can see why you love it here," Robert said, looking out over the garden and the fields beyond. "It's peaceful." Harold and I used to sit out here every evening after dinner. We'd talk about our days, make plans for the garden, watch the kids play in the backyard when they were little. I paused, surprised by how easy it felt to share these memories with Robert. I haven't set out here much since he died. Too many ghosts, I suppose. And tonight? I considered the question, taking stock of my emotions. Tonight feels different. Like maybe the ghosts can coexist with new possibilities. Robert set down his coffee cup and turned slightly toward me. Margaret, can I ask you something? Of course. What do you want from this? From us, I mean. I know it's early to be having this conversation, but I find myself thinking about where we might be heading, and I'd rather be honest about expectations than guess and get it wrong. The directness of the question took my breath away, but I appreciated it. At our age, there was something to be said for clarity over romance. I don't know, I said honestly. A month ago, I would have said I wanted to be left alone, to live quietly with my memories. But these past few weeks with you have reminded me how much I enjoyed having someone to share things with. Not just the big moments, but the small daily pleasures. Good meals, interesting conversations, someone to call when something funny happens. Companionship. Yes, but more than that. I find myself caring about your day, wondering how your book discussion group went, looking forward to our phone calls. I paused, gathering courage. I think I want to see where this goes, Robert, not rushing toward anything, but not holding back out of fear either. Robert reached for my hand, and this time I didn't hesitate to interlace our fingers. I want that too. I want to keep getting to know you, to be part of your life, to introduce you to the parts of mine that matter. What does that look like, practically speaking? He smiled at my pragmatism. More dinners, more conversations. Maybe I could take you to the book discussion group sometime. I think you'd enjoy the people. Maybe you could show me your church, meet some of your friends. Maybe we could plan a day trip somewhere, just to have an adventure together. The word adventure made me smile. When was the last time I'd thought of anything in my life as an adventure? I'd like that. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the evening sounds, crickets, a distant train whistle, the soft hoot of an owl in the oak tree. My hand felt natural in Robert's, and I found myself thinking about all the small intimacies of long relationships that I'd taken for granted with Harold. The way couples develop their own shorthand, their private jokes, their comfortable silences. Robert, I said eventually, thank you. For what? For being patient with my nervousness, for not making me feel foolish about being out of practice at all of this, for treating my memories of Harold with respect instead of seeing them as competition. Margaret, your memories of Harold aren't competition for me. They're proof that you know how to love well. That's not threatening. It's reassuring. I turned to look at him in the dim porch light, struck by the wisdom in that comment. Eleanor was lucky to have you, and Harold was lucky to have you. As the evening grew later and cooler, we reluctantly moved inside. Robert helped me carry the coffee cups to the kitchen, and we fell into an easy rhythm of washing and drying dishes together. There was something domestic and comfortable about the activity, as if we'd been doing this for years instead of hours. I should probably head home, Robert said as we finished up. Early morning tomorrow. I'm helping my neighbor finish that barbecue grill project. I walked him to the front door, reluctant for the evening to end, but knowing it was the right time. On the front porch, under the light I'd left on for him, Robert turned to face me. Thank you for a wonderful evening, for dinner, for showing me your home, for trusting me with your stories. Thank you for the flowers, for helping with dishes, for making me laugh. We stood there for a moment, and I could feel the possibility of a real kiss hanging in the air between us. This time, I didn't step back. When Robert leaned down and kissed me gently on the lips, I kissed him back, feeling simultaneously like a woman discovering something new and like myself again for the first time in years. The kiss was brief, soft, more about connection than passion. When we separated, Robert rested his forehead against mine for just a moment. "Good night, Margaret." "Good night, Robert." I watched him drive away before going back inside and turning off the porch light. The house felt different, not empty, but full of new possibilities. I walked through the rooms, turning off lights and checking locks, the same routine I'd followed for 18 months of widowhood. But tonight, everything felt changed. In my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Harold's photograph, as I did every night. "Well," I said aloud, my voice soft in the quiet room. That was unexpected. I told Harold about the evening, Robert's appreciation for the garden, the easy conversation over dinner, the way it had felt so natural to have someone to cook for again. I described the kiss, the gentle warmth of it, the way it had felt like a door opening rather than a betrayal. "I think you'd like him," I said finally. "He loved his wife the way you loved me. He knows about loss and memory and the way love changes but doesn't diminish. I think this might be good for me." As I prepared for bed, I found myself humming again, the same unconscious happiness that had been sneaking up on me for weeks. In the bathroom mirror, I caught sight of my reflection and was surprised by what I saw. A woman who looked content, hopeful, maybe even a little bit in love. The thought should have terrified me, but instead it filled me with a quiet joy. At 64, I was discovering that the heart doesn't stop hoping, doesn't stop being capable of surprise. Tomorrow, Robert would call, and we'd make plans for our next adventure. Whatever that turned out to be, I was ready for it. I was ready to keep living.